This is Empowered Human Academy. Welcome home.
They take a setback as this isn't working, or this I'm a failure, or I need a different approach, rather than this is maybe an expected part of the journey.
This is about love. This is about light. This is about the idea that you have everything you will ever need.
And this life of yours, this is where you grow, you expand, and you remember who you really are.
I'm Abe.
I'm Isaac.
In Empowered Human Academy, we join with humans of all kinds to feel the inspiration that can only come with empowered living.
The stories you hear today are unique, but the energy you hear today belongs to you too. So, with hearts wide open, let's begin.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the conversation series. My name is Abe, this is Isaac, and we are with our friend, Dr. Vickie Bhatia. She's a clinical psychologist and a Whole30 coach. We met actually in the Whole30 community a couple years ago at a book launch. We were just kind of talking about that before, like, where did we meet? I'm so excited to have Dr. Vickie here. She is a badass. Everyone we've been talking to is badass lately, and it's just been so inspiring. Dr. Vickie uses her social media to like truly make an impact in people's lives through her work and how she shows up. So we're just so grateful to have her here, and I think you're going to be learning a lot today. So Dr. Vickie, thank you for being here. And Isaac, why don't you ask the first question?
We like to start by asking people about their self-established identities. People all often introduce themselves in terms of their work or whatever else, but everyone chooses different words for themselves. And I'm curious, what words do you choose when you are describing who you actually are?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you guys. So how do I describe myself? Let's see. So I would describe myself as the daughter of immigrants. Both my parents came over from India. I was born here, so I'm first generation American. I am daughter, sister, friend. For work, I'm a clinical psychologist. And like you said, I'm also a Whole30 certified coach. But I really view myself, first and foremost as, kind of a woman trying to kind of make an impact in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what kind of impact is that? Like, what is, another question we come back to often lately is like, what do you have inside of yourself that you know the world needs? What does that impact look like?
So I really would love to, if I could get everyone to become more comfortable with their emotions and more in touch with how they're feeling, and more sort of comfortable expressing kind of those vulnerable or more difficult emotions, I feel like that would make a wonderful impact on the world.
That makes sense. How have you been doing that?
So obviously, I have a clinical practice. So I work in a hospital during the day. So I have a lot of patients there. I also have a clinical private practice that I do kind of in the evenings. And a lot of our work, really does focus on sort of emotional awareness, development around those skills to become more aware of what's going on. And then learning how to express those emotions and manage them more effectively. So in my clinical practice, I specialize in couples therapy. And so I do a lot of this work with couples in terms of kind of getting below the surface in terms of what is kind of going on or what the other person sees, and really talking about like what's going on for each individual person, what are the emotional sensitivities that get activated, and how do we react to those, and how does that kind of fit into a dynamic within a relationship.
Mm-hmm. And where do you start with your clients who are there seeking help? And a lot of people, watching this course, they might be at the doors open and they want to change their life, but they might not necessarily know how. How do you start with them? How do you start the conversation?
Yeah, so it depends. I think, obviously some people have a more clear idea kind of coming in as to what some of their, kind of obstacles are in terms of living that sort of fulfilling life. Other times people are maybe aware that something is off, but they can't really identify exactly what that is. In that case, we'll probably do a little bit more of a deep dive into different domains in their life, whether that is relationships, work, kind of self-esteem, how they show up in the world, health, obviously, like all of those different things. We'll kind of take a deep dive into that and figure out, what their values are, and if they are kind of living a life that's sort of aligned with those values. And then if not, how can we kind of go about making adjustments to get them closer to that sort of quality of life that they're looking for?
Totally. And has there been a time where you might not have thought about that for your own life, like in your personal life? How did you get to a place where you were able to help people in that?
Yeah. So I think that, I don't know that many people who are drawn to psychology don't have some personal reason behind it. And, I think that that's true because all of us are sort of interested in obviously learning more about ourselves and understanding how the world around us works. And so I am no different in that. But I also think that, it's a little bit like the more that you know, the more that you kind of realize like, oh, like there are definitely some adjustments that I can make. And there are definitely some things that maybe I should be working towards as well. And so certainly kind of in college, I started to have a little bit of that awareness, but it was still relatively surface level. I've struggled with depression since adolescence. And so I kind of knew that was a part of it. But it really wasn't until graduate school and kind of beyond that I really got a much better sense of kind of what activates those emotions and beliefs and things like that for me. And then the really hard work of kind of going through and addressing those.
Yeah. How do you remember a point when you realized maybe something that caused you to become depressed in your earlier childhood? And what was that kind of like?
Yeah. So I don't remember an exact moment, but, I don't really remember a time where I haven't been pretty critical or harsh with myself. I say that I'm a recovering perfectionist. I can remember kind of as a kid being very, very upset about not doing well in school. And by not doing well, I meant like an A-. And I think part of that is sort of coming from an immigrant family. There was a lot of emphasis on education and doing well because, if you want to kind of have the American life, have the American dream, education is kind of paramount to that. And so, I don't think that it was anything sort of malicious from my parents, but it was a lot of internalized kind of judgment and criticism that I put on myself as well. And so there was a point in graduate school where I kind of realized like, this is not actually as positive as I think it is. This is actually not helping me quite to the extent that I thought. Like there are certainly good things about it. And, if I can kind of like harness that, that's wonderful. But there's a lot of ways in which it held me back and really prevented me from, kind of doing the things that I wanted to. It kept me kind of like locked into fear and being afraid to kind of step out of that comfort zone unless I knew that I was going to do something well. And so that was kind of a turning point for me.
And you said locked into fear. I feel like so many people, myself included at times, like are so locked into fear. Can you share like what happens in the brain when that happens?
Yeah. So I think, kind of stepping back, just thinking about kind of like the function of our emotions, right? Like first and foremost, like our brain is always focused on survival. That is its top goal. So, I know that you guys are talking a lot about kind of like happiness and really locking into some of the positive emotions. But, if we are in a situation where our potential like survival is at stake, our brain does not care if we have happiness, right? Like that is irrelevant. And so our brain is sort of attuned to negative information that may kind of alert us to possible threat or things like that. So fear is something that happens it's an automatic sort of emotion that can happen, and it's designed to protect us. So, if we had to think a lot about it, it wouldn't be particularly effective, right? So if you're walking in the woods and there's, you turn the corner and there's a bear, if you had to think about like, well, what do I do now? And how do I react? And where can I go? That's not going to be as effective as if, our brain sort of has that like automatic fight or flight response. The adrenaline starts kind of immediately. we sort of get into that space. But, you know, as I know you guys are aware, like, that is supposed to be a short-term kind of experience, right? We are supposed to have that fight or flight response, get ourselves out of danger, and then kind of have that relaxation response come on where we get out of that state, because staying in that chronic fight or flight state is actually really detrimental to our body, our brain, our health, because we are not supposed to be kind of constantly in that kind of, you know, kind of state of being.
So what does that look like if somebody remains, like, even at a physiological level, I guess? What does it look like if somebody remains in that state of like high alertness? I don't know the other words for it, but if that for weeks or months or years at a time, what happens?
Yeah, so it can become really, it can really just kind of like become corrosive to a lot of different systems in our body. So when we have kind of that like high cortisol for long periods of time, that can throw off just like the homeostasis in our body. So that can look like, you know, kind of like a weakened immune system. It can look like, you know, like chronic inflammation. It can look like sort of this hypervigilance and sort of being on guard and sort of being easily startled. It can be irritability and kind of like this reactive sort of approach to things. It can really manifest in a couple different ways, and it depends also on kind of when this started. So when we talk about the fight or flight response, there's actually a third response, right? So there's the freeze response as well. And what we know is that for people who have experienced childhood trauma, the freeze response may actually be their primary kind of response. And that's more of like an emotional shutting down that is
themselves.
Like at a more extreme level, it can be like dissociation, you know, kind of like almost like this like emotional numbing, all of that sort of process.
So I sit for straight here because I feel like I've never heard those words before, and I identify with some of that. I feel like when I get into a stressful situation, that's my default response, just like put everything on lock for a second. So from a very personal place of motivation, how do you work with people who have learned that emotional habit?
Yeah, so depending on kind of what it actually looks like, right? So if there's like, if it's at the more extreme, like if it's dissociation, then we really need to work on being able to kind of keep present in a given moment, whether that is using grounding techniques, whether that is using mindfulness, but being able to kind of pull ourselves back into a given moment rather than sort of dissociating and sort of being, you know, living in the past or even kind of in the future. So that's a big part of it. Freezing is not necessarily a bad thing.
Sure.
You know, kind of taking a moment to pause and sort of say, how do I want to react? May not be a bad thing,
Sure.
But the key is like, how long does it actually last, right? If we're like sort of paralyzed then and we're unable to make a decision or unable to kind of go forward, that becomes problematic. You know, we don't want to necessarily freeze if the bear is right in front of us, right?
Sure.
But if we are in a situation where maybe there isn't like an immediate threat, but it's more of a looming threat where we may have to prepare, freezing may actually be okay in that moment because we, you know, we have a little bit more of a grace period.
Yeah, that makes sense. So for somebody who doesn't, actually, here, let me put this a different way. Can you tell me the story of somebody, in whatever level of detail is appropriate, tell me the story of somebody that you've worked with who has gone from a place of operating maybe perpetually in these spaces, freeze, fight, flight, or freeze, and they've come into a place where they have a better relationship with those responses?
Sure. So I'm just trying to think of so I work with a lot of people who have trauma, a lot of childhood trauma, a lot of, I work with a lot of veterans. I work with a lot of people who have military trauma, sexual trauma, things like that. And like I said, you know, kind of depending on the type of trauma and the period of time, it can look really different. I'm thinking of someone who had both kind of early childhood sexual trauma as well as military sexual trauma. And so it's a sort of repetitive pattern of kind of like repeated like violations, betrayal, all of these different things. And this person, it was interesting because, after the childhood trauma, she sort of developed this kind of like reckless, like impulsive kind of reactive style. Like, I don't care, things are going to happen, bad things in the world are going to happen. And so actually ended up taking a lot more risks and put herself in some really kind of dangerous situations, which then reinforced that belief that like bad things are going to happen to me, right? So our initial work kind of really focused on being able to address kind of just like the safety like behaviors and things that we needed to focus on in that regard. And then addressing some of these beliefs about not just herself and her worth, but kind of the world around and, not thinking of everything as dangerous and out to get her and kind of feeling like she had no control as she moved through the world. And then what was sort of interesting is that kind of as that, kind of started to become a little bit more of her sort of baseline, she wasn't taking as many risks, but she ended up actually kind of like overcompensating in some ways and sort of pulling back and withdrawing then from the world. Mm-hmm. So she wasn't sort of showing up in this kind of like impulsive or reckless way, but now she was kind of withdrawn and avoidant and still fearful of what was going to happen, but in a different approach. So there was a little bit more of that. Then we had to kind of do some exposures around kind of taking some risks, obviously in a very kind of safe and calculated way, but to gather data about, how she could kind of show up in the world and still potentially be okay.
Sure.
Well, and I think like what's beautiful about that approach, it's similar to this course. It's like you have to identify, then you have to like start practicing all these different kind of techniques. And from the client that you're talking about, they overcorrected, right? And they had to like reassess and practice and see just what works for them. And that's what's so beautiful about kind of this course is that I want people to see that like what is right for you is different than me. And like, it's going to be different and that's okay. And to trust ourselves along the way with resources, be it a coach, a psychologist, whatever it is, family members who support you, environments that support you. And it's all part of it, right? So it's not just like, I'm going to go work out. Like that won't delete your mindfulness practices of kind of destructive messages for yourself, right? Mm-hmm. They're all really connected.
And what's right for you at a given time in your life may not be right for you at another point in your life.
Yes, totally. So how, and I think I might I don't know where I'm going to put this in the course yet. And we're just honest in all of this conversation, but I feel like week 3 or 4, it's week 1 and 2 is kind of like unfucking your brain, figuring out like truly like where you're at and why you're feeling like crap or what you want in this next thing, in this next part of your life. And then week 3 and 4 is like thinking about what it looks like, what it feels like. And then week 5 is like sustainability. Let's talk about sustainability. Because I feel like, we met in the Whole30 program and it is a program. It is an experiment, right? It's not supposed to be full year-long, lifelong commitment, but truly just to see what foods work for you. What have you seen or what have you experienced with your clients and even in your life that really kind of enforces the sustainability is key message? Like, what does that look like in your practice? What does it look like in your life? Does that make sense?
I think so. Can I answer this a slightly different way and talk first about kind of what gets in the way of sustainability?
Yes.
So I think the most common things that I see with my clients are a couple of things. So I think the first is that a setback is inevitable. It's going to happen at some point, and people don't know how to react to that. So they take a setback as this isn't working, or I'm a failure, or I need a different approach, rather than this is maybe an expected part of the journey, right? So, in therapy, I often talk about how initially when people come to therapy, you may feel worse before you start to feel better, right? Because you have maybe been avoiding a lot of things for a really long time. And so now that we're starting to uncover that, it's really easy for people to come and, week 2 or 3 or sessions 2 and 3 say, this is not working. I feel worse and I'm going to walk away, rather than sort of understanding that is part of the journey. And setbacks are going to happen, right? So I think that's the first one, responding to setbacks and how we talk to ourselves about that and what we kind of say. I think the second big thing is worthiness. I think a lot of times people feel like they're not worthy of those changes, of sustaining those changes, of the positive things that come with that. People, and this is hard to say exactly because it's so broad, but people will end up in a situation where they're starting to see some of the benefits. They're starting to see maybe some of the payoff, and that worthiness, that unworthiness sort of belief kicks in, and they end up potentially self-sabotaging or doing something to reinforce those old beliefs of what they think they deserve. And then I think the third thing is that the third thing that I often see is this like all or nothing kind of mentality, this all or nothing mindset, where, it's kind of that perfectionist kind of quality, right? So it's like, either I am doing this perfectly or I am a complete, I'm a complete failure.
Girl, let me just interrupt.
Yeah.
Okay. I feel like that with my course right now. Like, it's my first course, but I know what I'm talking about. We're talking to brilliant people. I've impacted my clients' lives and they've impacted mine. But like, even sometimes in the conversations or building this course, there are points in it where I'm like, oh my God, this isn't perfect. And my brain automatically wants to say, stop. But it's a practice to say, no, what's the end goal? And I need to get through it. I need to figure out a healthy way to get through it and cheer myself on because I'm worthy of this, right? So like the last part, like this worthiness and self-sabotage, like that's so crazy and it's so real, right?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of funny because I spent the last 3 hours before this, like working on materials for my Whole30 group. And I just couldn't get something the way that I wanted it. It was just not turning out the way that I want. I'm not creative in that kind of way. I like had a vision, but I couldn't execute. And yeah, like at some point, like the thought was I should just completely abandon this, and just start with something else or just leave it for maybe next group when I have more time to prepare it.
And you're literally a clinical psychologist. Like,
yeah,
we need to normalize that this is such a normal process in it all.
And then like kind of the sort of response to this that I work with both myself as well as my clients is it's kind of an exposure, right? So let's put something that's imperfect out there and see what happens. Yes. That's the only way that we're going to be able to sit more comfortably in that gray zone is if we have experiences and data to suggest that, like, all right, yeah, this form doesn't look great, but like, is someone going to say something? If they do, how am I going to respond? Can I tolerate that negative feedback or that judgment from somebody else? And the more that we do that, the easier it becomes to kind of get out of that. And the more data we collect to sort of suggest that we are worthy and that we are deserving of these things.
Yes. Why do you think we're so hypercritical of ourselves?
I think we get a lot of messages, right, from society, from depending on potentially the household that you grew up in. I think that particularly, research suggests, as well as like what I've seen sort of clinically, is anyone with sort of a marginalized identity is more likely to have some of these more sort of like critical or be more sort of hyper aware for that judgment because it means something different, right? Mm. And because it can be a cue for danger or threat or survival or things like that. So, for example, working with like brown and black individuals. You know, judgment or criticism may be kind of innocuous, but it also could be kind of a red flag. It could be, you know, depending on the situation, what's going on, it could be a real threat, right? And so we sort of develop those kind of that sensitivity around it, as well as, you know, kind of from stories that we hear or from other experiences of people around us, right? So if we live in a community or if we know other people who, you know, have been really harshly judged or criticized or even worse, right, like kicked out of a community or things like that, we're going to be kind of more on guard for those things.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. So given the varying landscape of life, what does a healthy relationship with fear look like? What do you listen for? What do you don't? Like, what is that relationship like in a healthy context?
It's a good question.
Yeah. So, you know, kind of when we think about like fear and anxiety, they're obviously very linked. The difference being that like fear is like an immediate threat in our environment, whereas anxiety is an unknown possible threat in the future. So kind of dealing with fear is a little bit different than sort of anxiety. But I think first and foremost, we want to kind of become really clear as to what exactly it is that we're even worried about or what we're kind of in fear of. Oftentimes, we may kind of have that feeling, but it may be hard to even articulate, like, what do I actually think is going to happen? Like, what is the worst case scenario here? And then we can kind of, you know, check in with ourselves. So in terms of like a healthy response, it would be kind of one, being able to identify when you are in anxiety or fear, and then being able to kind of pause, ask yourself, like, what is actually going on right now? And then being able to kind of respond in an effective way, whether that is kind of taking preparations for that threat, or kind of being able to cognitively say, that's maybe not actually that realistic. That's a very low probability. It's far more likely that this is going to happen. And, you know, kind of what do I need to do to manage kind of that emotion in the moment?
That's how I feel with flying. I have a fear of flying, but I try to make myself as prepared as possible. I look at the weather, and some people might say that like exacerbates my anxiety, but actually it makes me feel more prepared to be like, okay, I know I'm going to encounter turbulence right now. This is what I know is going to happen. So I don't need to be fearful. Or sometimes I'm like, honestly, like I'm flying on a plane. The fatality rate is so low. Get over it, Abe. Like, how many flights have you been on this year? Like, just chill. So, and it really depends on the mood of the day, right? And like having different tools is really, really beneficial.
Yeah. And I do think that like sometimes people, so I think that education is obviously important, and that can alleviate a lot of concerns just when we have accurate data about things. But I also think that sometimes it can become a form of avoidance and actually taking action. Because there's always something that we could learn or look up or research. And sometimes that becomes a way of avoiding having to actually take action.
Yeah, that makes sense. What kind of changes do you see in the folks that you work with and all your different practices as they start to learn how to have these internal conversations and how to recognize like with a clear vision, what's going on with their emotions and their fear responses? What kind of changes do you see in their expression and what their lives start to look like, all of that?
Yeah, the sort of interesting thing is that kind of when we address like some of these like foundational pieces, they may have come in looking for improvement in like one specific area of their life, but it really translates to all of their other sort of areas of life. You know, so for example, when people start to feel better about themselves, they start taking care of themselves better. They start showing up differently kind of with their loved ones. They, you know, they're more likely to take kind of risks, calculated risks, in making changes, whether that is leaving a job or leaving a relationship or, you know, starting something new, making a move, like all of these different things that may not have been kind of the focus of treatment whatsoever. But as people, you know, kind of become more compassionate with themselves, kind of develop better boundaries with themselves and other people. It really translates into just so many different areas.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
How do people react when they start to see that happening in themselves? Like when you point out that, oh, this is actually affecting several areas of your life, how do people respond to that observation?
Yeah. So a lot of times I am the one pointing it out because people don't necessarily recognize it initially on their own. And I would say that the majority of people first think that it's like a fluke or like this is just a coincidence.
Worthiness. Does it come back to the worthiness? Like, this can't happen to me. Like, maybe? Or
that they didn't really believe that they had that much of an impact or control on different areas of their life. And so, they're like, that must have just been a coincidence because it's not like I could have done that, right? Like, it's not like I had any impact or control over that area. And then when it starts showing up more and more and more, it's like, well, like I believe in coincidences, but at some point, it's no longer really a coincidence. And then I think that's where we have to be kind of on guard for like those potential self-sabotaging kind of behaviors, kind of those old beliefs kind of getting activated, those like setbacks and how we respond to them, all those different things.
Amazing. So say people are on like week 6 of this program and beyond. They're practice sustainability, but they might not be able to recognize the interconnectedness that you were talking about. How can the people who are listening right now become aware that their practices are actually becoming productive and healthy?
So I'm a big fan of kind of journaling and taking stock of things, and not necessarily in like a Dear Diary kind of way. This doesn't have to be like, every night I'm going to talk about what my day consisted of, but just sort of like periodic sort of checking in with yourself about these different things. I'm a fan of sort of like setting goals, but then also breaking them down into smaller kind of tangible pieces. But really being able to like have some way of sort of tracking data and sort of progress over time. Because I think that especially when there are sort of like small incremental changes, we may not sort of recognize the overall shift that happens over a longer period of time. So I'm definitely a big fan of, kind of starting that with like what's going on in different areas of your life right now. And then 3 months from now, 6 months from now, kind of checking in and, looking at like, oh, wow, look at this. Like this has changed maybe more than I expected, or, oh, I didn't even realize this had changed until I looked back at what things had been like 3 months ago.
I've seen with my coaching clients that some people are like, wow, I didn't even know didn't even recognize that I was that bad. And like, how can I start? That was crazy. Like I couldn't sleep and now I'm sleeping so well. Like I don't even remember what that feels like, nor do I want to, right? And it's only been 6 months. Sure. Yeah. So that's why I always have them write down, and I write down like, where are you now? So I can be like, do you remember when you couldn't sleep? And do you know how like we need to celebrate these wins? So how do you celebrate your wins with your clients, with yourself? Let's start with yourself first. How do you celebrate your development?
Yeah. There's definitely room for growth in that area. But I think that, I think that first it's like just acknowledging it and again, being able to sort of take ownership of that. I think that sometimes what happens, especially in our society, is that there is this idea that if we sort of take ownership of our progress, of our success, then we're bragging, or we have a big ego, or we're narcissistic, right? Like all these words that people throw out. And of course nobody wants to look kind of appear that way or anything like that. And also like messaging that we get around, like especially women, I think, get messages around downplaying kind of successes, being humble, not being showy or braggy. And so, just acknowledging it and sort of owning it, I think, is a big piece of sort of celebrating it. And that doesn't mean that we have to be, it doesn't have to be this huge celebration, or it doesn't have to be kind of, uncomfortable in whatever that might look like for that person, right? Because we all have different ways also of doing that. But I think that not diminishing, not minimizing our success and our achievements. It's like the yes, but, like, yes, I did this, but I had a lot of help along the way. Or like, yes, I did this, but blah, 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 right? So if we can say yes, like, yeah, like I did that, right? Yes. And we don't have to minimize that. I think that is a big piece of just owning it.
Well, and I feel like we've normalized suffering and we haven't normalized thriving because of these words that are like, well, you're extra or you're narcissistic. Like, and does the brain change? How does the brain change, like, chemically, when you are not in a fight or flight state to like a truly healthy state? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when we're not sort of in that fight or flight state, right, there's just so many other brain processes that actually get to happen because when we are in fight or flight, both body and brain, like I said, we're focused on survival. And so there are a lot of like non-essential kind of processes that happen in our body that if we are actually in survival mode, our body's going to kind of like shut down other parts of other processes because those are not sort of essential in that moment, right? Sure. So for example, at a very basic level, right? Like if we're trying to escape from the bear, then our body is not concerned about like processing what we had for lunch, right? Like it's like, screw digestion. We need to like put all of our energy towards like blood flow to the legs so we can run and get out.
Yeah.
Right? And so, kind of, if we think about this like longer term and all of that, in terms of our brain, like there are lots of things that, happen in terms of like memory consolidation and neuroplasticity and kind of growth and making new connections, being able to focus and learn. All of these different things are not necessarily essential. They're essential to thriving, but they're not necessarily essential to sort of surviving in a moment.
And you can't really tap into that if you're constantly in a state of stress.
It's much harder to. Yeah, it's much harder to.
Yeah, okay. So it's not even just like, as I develop a better relationship with these reactions and I learn how to manage them and move beyond them, it's not just like I won't be afraid anymore. It's I may learn more about what my expression actually looks like when I have access to all of these functions.
Yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting that I see with individuals who have dealt with sort of depression, who have dealt with anxiety, PTSD. One of like the biggest shifts sometimes is just around like the ability to focus and concentrate. Because when you're not necessarily like hyper vigilant to all these other things in our environment, we actually have the ability to kind of focus and sustain focus, which then obviously opens up a lot more sort of avenues for productivity, for learning, for creativity, like all of these different things that aren't really possible when we are in that like super hypervigilant fight or flight kind of state.
That's fascinating. Okay. What do you say to people who are like, they're starting to flirt with the idea of like maybe my depression isn't inevitable or permanent, but they're just beginning to think about climbing beyond that or exploring beyond that? For people who are on that threshold, what would you tell them given everything that you know?
Yeah, so I think that, getting a good sort of healthcare team is really important. Whether that means, whether that includes medication or not, right? So I think that sometimes that also gets a really bad rap, and medication can be very, very useful for a number of people. But it's also just one option. It's not necessarily the only one, even though it may be the
Kickstarter.
Yeah, and maybe kind of the primary one that is kind of defaulted to kind of within our medical kind of model. But, so I think, finding a healthcare team that you can kind of work with holistically to be able to address various aspects of health, right? Because, the way that our medical model is kind of set up right now is that everything is like, on their own and separate, when in fact we know that everything's sort of intertwined, right? So this is part of the reason I became a Whole30 certified coach, is because I started to learn so much more about nutritional psychiatry and how what we eat affects our mental health. And then I was like, why are we not talking about this? Like, and it was something that never had been talked about in my graduate school training. besides talking about like the effect of caffeine on like anxiety and sleep. Like that was the most that we got in terms of anything nutritional.
Wow.
We need to have you back for a separate conversation just about nutritional psychiatry. I've never heard that expression before.
Me either.
Yeah, it's a new and kind of emerging field, and there's really cool research coming out of it.
Can you just share briefly just a quick highlight from that? I mean, because we could talk about that for hours, but because I'm super passionate about what happens post scarcity, post fight or flight, right? Because I lived my life in mostly fight or flight, and I feel like I'm on the leading edge for my life of what happens in this thriving state, because that's also not really talked about, and I want to normalize it, because like there is this beautiful path that is so bright and vibrant and healthy, where one fuck up doesn't mess my whole day up anymore, right? Whereas I would beat myself up over it before. So can you share a little bit about that?
Just a glimpse.
A glimpse of the highlight of food.
I'll tell you kind of like the first thing that I learned in terms of nutritional psychiatry that started to get me interested in looking at that field.
Yeah.
So I don't remember how I came across this study, but I'm so glad that I did, because it like opened up this world. But it was looking at, individuals who had sort of chronic depression, and essentially the study found that for the group who added a probiotic to their diet, that's literally the only thing different that they did. They added a probiotic. They had like a moderate sort of decrease in their depressive symptoms over 12 weeks or something like that. So it was like the equivalent of a mild sort of antidepressant, right? So then I was like, how does a probiotic kind of affect depression, right? Well, now there's all this new research kind of showing that our gut bacteria really affects kind of all different sort of systems in terms of our brain and mental health. We know that inflammation in our body really affects depression, anxiety, things like that. So there is really cool stuff sort of happening there, and a lot of research is being funded right now, which I'm really excited about, because that will hopefully mean that this will continue to grow in the years coming up.
Awesome. That's super exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay. Let's have another conversation about this another time. I'm very excited. Okay. So you use the expression leading edge, and you identified where in your life do you feel like that edge is, where you are developing and learning?
Yeah.
Where is that for you? Where in your life are you actively developing?
Oh, so I would say that that for me is kind of becoming more comfortable with taking risks. Mm-hmm. So being able to, so it's still in some ways, like it's still kind of like hilarious to me that I have like a professional Instagram account, because I spent literally decades of my life trying to be as invisible as possible.
Wow. Really?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
Okay.
Tell us more.
Yeah, tell us more.
I was just like, I was so afraid of judgment and sort of criticism and being perceived negatively that I figured like, if people just didn't see me, then they wouldn't be able to judge me. Right. And so I did not sort of go out for a lot of things. I did not sort of take opportunities. I don't have a lot of pictures from kind of earlier years, because I refused to be in photographs. Or deleted them immediately, things like that. So now it's kind of like hilarious to me that like I am doing things like this and, like podcasts, and have like an Instagram account where I show my face and like all of these different things. And so I would say that is kind of the continued sort of edge for me in terms of like stepping past that fear and just like showing up.
And what does that feel like to show up, and how, like, I mean, because you'll be in either week 4 or 5 or 3, who knows where you're going to be in this week series, but how, like, you were fearful, then when was the turning point? And then how does that practice look like for you?
So initially when I started my Instagram account, that was like a big step. And then I was like, well, no one will find it. It's okay. No one will find it. And so initially, like, there were no photos of me or anything like that. And I don't remember exactly. I remember it like it was like terrifying, and it was like, what are people going to say? Especially like other other mental health professionals, like, what are they going to say? Are they going to be like, you're wrong? Like, you don't know what you're talking about, right?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Are you an Enneagram 3, by the way?
I am. Yeah.
Oh, me too, girl. Me too. That's okay. Yes, I feel that. Everything you're like saying is so rude.
So like initially that was it. Honestly, I think like one of the big turning points was when Melissa Urban contacted me about being on the Do the Thing podcast. And initially I almost said no, because I was like so fearful. I was like, no way, that's like way too big of a platform. Like, I don't think so. But I had just become a Whole30 certified coach, and I felt like I was like, can I really say no to this? Like, I don't know. Obviously I'm really glad that I didn't, but that to me was actually kind of like a really big sort of turning point, and sort of seeing that like no one wrote me hate mail. Nobody was like, you don't know what you're talking about. No one was like, you're super, scattered and didn't know what to say and you sounded terrible and whatever. That was actually the point in which I was like, well, maybe I can take a little bit more risk here.
Cool. Awesome. Was it uncomfortable?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Sure. And what was your self-talk like to get, because I mean, in fearful situations, fear sometimes like stands beside us, and it's still with us, right? Sometimes it doesn't go away. When I'm flying, sometimes it's still with me, but it doesn't overtake me. So was fear, what did it look like for you? What did your practices look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, so honestly, like if this had happened like even a year prior to that, like I probably would have been in a completely different space. And so I think because I had done so much work around kind of my own perfectionism and around my own fear, I was in a place where like my self-talk wasn't as bad as it had been in the past. And so that was a big thing. But like, yeah, still like I was still kind of like bargaining with myself. I was like, if this goes terrible, you'll just delete your account and like that'll be the end of that. But it wasn't like.
Thank you for sharing some of your purpose with us. This has been a super cool exploration into a bunch of things I didn't know very much about, and I want to learn more about nutritional psychiatry now. So thank you for that too.
And the time went by so fast. I mean, I could talk about this for hours. Thank you so much, Dr. Vickie. Y'all go check her out on Instagram. Go follow her journey. Go follow her information, because she is the real deal. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your heart, your mind, all of it.
Thank you so much for having me. And these were like wonderful questions that even got me to think about things. So I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
This podcast is the work of Lightward, our company, named for that toward the light direction which informs every single thing that we do, including money, which means, like everything else, the way we earn revenue is not based on industry norms. It's based on what feels deeply right and aligned by passing through the door that feels like it has more behind it, not less. And the way we keep this podcast going is all Lightward. It's pay what feels good. It's an exchange of value between you and us. We're keeping conventional podcast advertising totally out of this. And here's how Pay What Feels Good works. We give you this episode because it feels good to do so. And you consider, honestly, what number of dollars this episode is genuinely worth to you. I do not care if that's $3, $1,000, or literally $0 and a heart emoji, as long as that trade genuinely makes your day better. And the energy there is the entire point. That is what we're building our business on. No advertisers, no selling your attention, just you and us, trading value in a way that builds us both up. So whatever the number, when you're done listening, head to empoweredhumanacademy.com and hit the Pay What Feels Good button. We use this policy across all of our company's work, and I'm really excited to bring it here to the world of podcasts. This is us voting for the world that we want to see. Thank you for being here.